What if the most carefully protected image in modern public life didn't begin with a triumph, but with an erasure? Not a scandal caught on camera, not a leaked tape, not a photograph that escaped into the wild. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. An absence, because that's where the story starts, with something that should exist but doesn't. A wedding, a celebrity wedding, no less. Filmed, documented, captured from every angle the way Hollywood always does. A moment most people preserve obsessively, archive redundantly, protect like a family heirloom. A day people revisit when marriages end, when memories soften, when nostalgia creeps in. And yet, in this case, the footage allegedly vanished. Not lost, not misplaced, destroyed. If that sounds dramatic, slow down, sit with it for a second. Ask yourself a simple question before we go any further. Who orders their own wedding erased? Not metaphorically, not emotionally. Literally, files deleted, videos gone, photos wiped, hard drives cleared, backups removed, copies accounted for. Why would anyone do that? And more importantly, why would someone need to? I want to be careful here. This isn't about relitigating a marriage that ended more than a decade ago. This isn't about tabloid cruelty or voyeurism. This isn't about punishing someone for who they were before fame arrived. This is about power, control, and the quiet mechanics of image construction. Because when you follow the trail closely enough, what begins as a missing wedding video starts to look like something else entirely. A rehearsal, a test run, an early demonstration of how thoroughly a narrative can be managed if you're willing to pay the price. The name at the center of this story, of course, is Meghan Markle. By now, her public image is one of the most dissected, defended, criticized, and curated in the world. Every word parsed, every gesture slowed down, every contradiction litigated in real time across media ecosystems that barely sleep. But long before the palace, long before the titles, long before the global polarization, there was a different life, a quieter one, a more chaotic one, according to people who were there. A Hollywood life, less polished, less cautious, more improvisational, more human perhaps. And at the center of that earlier chapter was a man who has said almost nothing publicly about it. Trevor Engelson. That silence is not accidental. It's one of the most important elements of the story. Because in Hollywood, ex-spouses talk. They leak. They hint. They correct the record. They write books. They do podcasts. They finally tell their side. Trevor Engelson did none of that. For years. No tell-all. No counter-narrative. No late-night monologue circuit. No carefully timed interview when public sentiment shifted. Just silence. And when silence persists this long, it stops being neutral. It becomes a signal. Here's what we know, and here's what we don't. We know Meghan Markle and Trevor Engelson married in 2011 in Jamaica. A destination wedding. Intimate, yes, but not obscure. Friends, industry figures, cameras, celebration. By all accounts, at the time it was joyful, unrestrained, loose in a way that destination weddings often are. Less ceremony, more party. We know that in the years since, virtually no footage from that wedding has ever surfaced publicly. No official video clips, no candid reels, no nostalgic anniversary posts, not even the low-resolution fragments that tend to leak eventually from someone's phone or a forgotten backup. We also know that in the modern celebrity ecosystem, that level of total visual absence is unusual. Suspiciously unusual, especially when the bride later becomes one of the most photographed women on Earth. Now, absence alone proves nothing. That matters. And we'll keep returning to that restraint throughout this series. But absence raises questions. And those questions become louder when multiple people independently begin telling similar versions of why that absence exists. According to several accounts that have circulated quietly for years, never fully confirmed, never formally denied, Meghan allegedly instructed Trevor to delete all videos and photos from their Jamaican wedding, not to archive them privately, not to lock them away, to destroy them. including footage that allegedly showed a version of her that would later clash with the carefully refined royal image. Party-style vows, Hollywood-inflected theatrics, a dress that some witnesses described as dramatic, unconventional, and entirely unsuited to the future she would eventually pursue. Let's pause here. This is where most coverage would rush forward, where headlines would harden, where conclusions would be drawn aggressively, prematurely. We're not doing that. Instead, we're asking a more uncomfortable question. If this footage truly existed, and multiple people say it did, why was it perceived as dangerous? Dangerous to whom? And dangerous when? Because here's the thing that doesn't quite add up if you take the simplest explanation. In 2011, Meghan Markle was not a global figure. She was not under palace scrutiny. She was not being vetted by courtiers or advisors or institutions obsessed with optics and tradition. So why delete the footage then? Why not later when circumstances changed? Unless the deletion wasn't about the present at all. Unless it was about anticipation. Unless someone, even then, understood that certain versions of themselves would become liabilities if the trajectory they hoped for ever materialized. That's not an accusation. It's a hypothesis, and it's one we'll keep testing. Because image management isn't something that suddenly appears when the crown enters the frame. It's often practiced quietly, privately, long before anyone is watching closely. Think about how people curate their social media profiles when they apply for a job. How old posts disappear, how photos are scrubbed, how timelines are rewritten. Now magnify that impulse, add ambition, add proximity to power, add a future that demands perfection. Suddenly, the idea of erasing inconvenient artifacts doesn't seem so alien. Still, weddings are different. They're emotional anchors. They're evidence of intimacy. They're hard to erase because they don't belong to one person alone. They exist in the memories of guests, in shared archives, in other people's phones and drives and closets. Which brings us back to Trevor Engelson. If the alleged deletion happened, he would have been central to it. Not because he held power over her image, but because he held access. He would have known where the footage lived. Who had copies? What needed to be erased to ensure nothing resurfaced later? And yet, he never spoke. Why? Was it loyalty? Was it legal pressure? Was it embarrassment? Was it indifference? Or was it something heavier? Something more complicated? Because erasing a wedding doesn't just protect one person's future. It binds everyone involved into a shared silence. It creates a mutual dependency, a quiet agreement that the past will remain sealed, not because it's ugly, but because it no longer fits. And when that agreement fractures, even slightly, the consequences ripple outward. Here's another question worth sitting with. Why is this story surfacing now? Not in 2012. Not in 2016. Not even at the height of royal controversy. Now, why are whispers getting louder? Why are former insiders more willing to speak off the record? Why does the absence feel heavier than it did before? Part of it may be exhaustion. Public fatigue with narratives that feel overly curated, with contradictions that are never addressed directly, with stories that demand belief without evidence while simultaneously insisting that evidence never mattered. Another part may be timing, the slow realization that once an image is locked in, it becomes harder to maintain than to create, and that what was erased early often returns later, not as footage, but as testimony. That's the danger of deletion. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty. They pull things in. Over the next chapters, we're going to move carefully, methodically. We'll examine Trevor Engelson's silence not as a footnote, but as a central clue. We'll look at how Hollywood culture treats reinvention, and when reinvention crosses into erasure. We'll explore why certain behaviors are celebrated in one context and condemned in another. And we'll ask whether the destruction of personal history is a price too high to pay for institutional acceptance. But we're not there yet. For now, all you need to hold on to is this. Somewhere, once, there was a wedding that people remember vividly and yet cannot show you. A day that exists only in fragments, in recollections, in uncomfortable pauses when certain questions are asked. And according to those who claim to know, it was erased not because it was forgettable, but because it was unforgettable in the wrong way. And if that's true, then what came next wouldn't just reshape a personal narrative, it would demand the systematic removal of an entire past. The first thing that bothers people who've looked closely at this story isn't the allegation itself, it's the logistics. Because deleting a wedding isn't as simple as pressing a button and moving on. Weddings are messy that way. They spill outward. They live in other people's devices. They exist in multiple formats, multiple hands, multiple places at once. Even small weddings generate an ecosystem of digital residue. Videos shot professionally, clips recorded casually, photos taken impulsively, badly framed, half-lit, never meant to be seen by anyone except the person who took them. So when people say this wedding vanished, the word itself deserves scrutiny. Vanished how? All at once? Gradually? Quietly? With cooperation or resistance? Because a true disappearance would require more than embarrassment. It would require intention, planning, follow-through, and above all, it would require time. Which brings us to the wedding itself. Not the mythology, not the later interpretations, just the facts that can't be disputed. In 2011, this was a destination wedding in Jamaica, not a secret elopement, not a courthouse signing, a celebration, a gathering that involved friends, colleagues, and people from the entertainment world who were already accustomed to documenting everything. This wasn't an era before smartphones. This wasn't a pre-digital age where memories lived only in photo albums tucked away in drawers. People were already recording, uploading, backing things up without thinking twice. So when no footage surfaced, not then, not later, it quietly raised eyebrows. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough for industry people to clock it and move on. At first, because in Hollywood, privacy requests aren't unusual. Celebrities often ask guests not to post. They request NDAs. They keep things controlled. That part is normal. What's not normal is when control doesn't relax over time. Most couples soften. They release a photo years later. They laugh about it in interviews. They let a clip surface once the emotional charge fades. Here, the opposite seemed to happen. The longer time passed, the tighter the silence became. People who attended the wedding have described it in private conversations as energetic, lively, unfiltered, less like a ceremony and more like a party that happened to include vows. The kind of night where things feel spontaneous, where formality dissolves, where no one is thinking about future optics because the future hasn't demanded them yet. If that's accurate, then the footage wouldn't be scandalous in the traditional sense. No crimes, no shock value, no obvious gotcha, just personality. And sometimes, personality is the most dangerous thing of all when you're trying to build a brand that demands restraint. Here's where the story starts to tilt. According to people familiar with the aftermath, the concern wasn't that the wedding showed anything immoral, it's that it showed too much of something else. A looseness, a performative flair, a version of self that clashed sharply with the image that would later be required, or adopted depending on who you ask. Think about how institutions work, not just royal ones. Corporations, political offices, media empires. They don't just regulate behavior going forward. They audit the past, they assess risk retroactively. And when something doesn't fit, it becomes a problem to be managed. Which raises a question that doesn't get asked often enough. Who decides which pasts are acceptable? And who does that work? Because the work of erasure is rarely done by the person who benefits most from it. It's outsourced, delegated, assigned to someone with less leverage, less visibility, less incentive to resist. That's where Trevor Engelson's role becomes harder to ignore. At the time of the wedding, he wasn't a public figure. He wasn't under scrutiny. He wasn't thinking about how footage might be weaponized years later. He was a husband, a producer, a participant. If there was an instruction to delete, it wouldn't have come from panic. It would have come from calculation, a recognition, early or gradual, that certain artifacts needed to disappear before they became inconvenient. And once you start down that road, there's no partial measure that feels safe. Deleting one copy isn't enough if another exists. Asking politely isn't enough if someone forgets. You'd have to be thorough, you'd have to follow up, you'd have to confirm. And every confirmation would tighten the net of silence. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Erasure creates witnesses. Every person who deletes something remembers that they did it. Every person who hands over a file knows what they gave up. Every person who complies carries a quiet awareness that something once existed and now doesn't. Those people don't forget. They wait. And sometimes, years later, they start asking themselves why they agreed. Now let's be clear. There is no publicly released checklist proving that such a deletion campaign occurred. No court filings. No official statements. No forensic recovery. What exists instead are patterns. Patterns of absence. Patterns of silence. Patterns of people declining to comment, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know exactly what they would say if they did. That distinction matters. Silence born of ignorance sounds different from silence born of knowledge. One is vague, the other is precise. And Trevor Engelson's silence has always felt precise. Not angry, not performative, not resentful, just sealed, which is unusual for an ex-husband whose former partner became one of the most famous women in the world. Think about the incentives. Speaking out would generate attention, sympathy, opportunities, platforms, and yet nothing. It's almost as if speaking would violate an agreement that was never written down, but deeply understood. Or as if reopening that chapter would invite consequences that outweigh the benefits. That's speculation, of course, but it's informed speculation based on how often silence aligns with leverage. There's another layer here that complicates things further. Weddings are emotional artifacts. They don't just document behavior. They document dynamics. Who leads? Who follows? Who performs? Who absorbs attention? A wedding video doesn't just show what someone said. It shows how they said it, how the room responded, where the energy flowed. Those things are harder to spin later. If the footage showed a version of someone who was bold, theatrical, commanding, traits celebrated in Hollywood, those same traits might later be framed as problematic in more conservative environments, which means the footage wouldn't just contradict an image, it would undermine a narrative of transformation. And transformation narratives are fragile. They rely on contrast, before and after, then and now. If the before refuses to stay hidden, the after becomes harder to defend. That's why erasure, if it happened, would have needed to be early, before anyone thought to save a copy out of nostalgia, before people realized how valuable the footage might become, before the stakes were obvious. And once that window closed, the only option left would be maintenance, reinforcing silence, deflecting curiosity, letting time do the rest. Time, after all, is the most effective eraser we have, except when it isn't, because time also changes power dynamics. People age out of fear. They lose patience. They reassess what loyalty bought them. And when they do, old decisions begin to feel heavier, which brings us back to now. Why this story feels closer to the surface than it did before. Why the absence of wedding footage is no longer just a curiosity but a question. And why Trevor Engelson's silence, once overlooked, now feels like a locked door everyone keeps walking past. Because behind that door isn't just a marriage that ended, it's a moment that refuses to be shown. A version of reality that doesn't align neatly with the one we're meant to accept. And if you believe the people who say the footage was deliberately destroyed, then the wedding wasn't just erased to protect an image. It was erased to prevent comparison. Comparison between who someone was allowed to be and who they later needed to become. And that's where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Because if a wedding could be erased this thoroughly, what else could be rewritten just as easily? And who else was asked to help make it disappear? He didn't disappear. That's the first misconception that needs clearing up. When people talk about Trevor Engelson after the divorce, they often describe him as if he stepped off the map, as if he retreated into obscurity, bruised and bitter, unable to cope with the scale of what came next. That's not what happened. He stayed right where he was, working, producing, building, quietly expanding his career in the same industry where reinvention is normal and selective memory is a professional skill. What he didn't do was talk. And in a culture that rewards talking, that incentivizes it, monetizes it, practically begs for it. That choice is strange enough to demand attention, because silence, when it's consistent, becomes a form of behavior. And behavior, in this story, is everything. Trevor Engelson was never a public-facing personality in the way actors or influencers are. He didn't cultivate a fan base. He didn't build a personal brand. His work happened behind the scenes, where deals are made quietly and success is measured in access rather than applause. That matters. People like that understand leverage. They understand what speaking costs and what staying silent preserves. So when the marriage ended, and later when Meghan Markle's public profile exploded beyond anything either of them could have reasonably predicted in 2011, Trevor found himself in a position very few ex-spouses ever occupy. He knew a version of her that no one else could verify visually. He had lived through years that would later be compressed into a few vague lines in official biographies. He had memories that couldn't be fact-checked by the public because the artifacts were missing. And yet, he didn't fill that gap. Ask yourself why. This isn't about morality, it's about incentives. Ex-spouses speak out when the emotional pressure outweighs the risk, when the narrative being told about them becomes so distorted that silence feels like complicity, when the benefits of telling the truth, financial, reputational, psychological, finally tip the scale. None of that seemed to happen here. Not when Meghan's acting career rose. Not when the royal relationship became public. Not when the wedding to Prince Harry turned her into a global figure. Not even when public debate around her character became deeply polarized. Through all of it, Trevor Engelson said nothing. No anonymous leaks. No strategic sources close to. No carefully worded denials or confirmations. Just absence. And absence, again, becomes data. People in Hollywood noticed it, quietly. They talked among themselves, not because they expected him to attack her, but because they expected something. A correction, a clarification, a human impulse to assert one's own version of shared history. That impulse never surfaced, which suggests one of two things. Either he had nothing meaningful to say, or he had everything to say, and a reason not to. The second possibility is harder to sit with, because it forces us to consider power dynamics that don't disappear just because a relationship ends. When a marriage dissolves, assets get divided, lives separate, but information doesn't evaporate. It stays lodged in people, and information, in certain contexts, is more valuable than money. Think about the asymmetry here. One person moves into an institution where image discipline is absolute, where narratives are negotiated, where optics aren't just important, they're existential. The other remains in an industry where discretion is currency and NDAs are routine. That's not a clean break. That's a delicate standoff. If there was an understanding, implicit or explicit, about what would never be discussed, it wouldn't need to be enforced publicly. It would live in the shared awareness of consequences. And consequences don't have to be dramatic to be effective. They just have to be credible. Career consequences, social consequences, legal consequences. The kind of consequences that don't make headlines but reshape trajectories. This is where speculation creeps in, and we need to slow it down. There is no public evidence that Trevor Engelson signed a specific agreement prohibiting him from speaking about the marriage. No leaked document, no court filing, no sworn testimony. But in Hollywood, formal paperwork is only part of how silence is maintained. Reputational pressure does the rest. Being known as someone who breaks confidences, even when legally allowed, carries a cost, especially for producers who rely on trust, access, and long-term relationships. So even if Trevor could speak, the question becomes, at what price? And that price would only increase as Meghan's profile rose, which may explain why his silence didn't crack under pressure. It adapted. It became more complete. There's another layer to this that often gets overlooked. Silence isn't passive. It's active maintenance. It requires restraint every time an opportunity to speak presents itself. Every journalist inquiry declined. Every off-the-record conversation carefully navigated. every casual question deflected. Over years, that kind of restraint becomes a discipline. People don't maintain it unless they believe something important is at stake. Now consider this alongside the allegation that wedding footage was destroyed. If Trevor participated in that destruction, even reluctantly, he wouldn't just be a witness. He'd be a collaborator in erasure. And collaborators carry a different kind of burden. They don't just know what happened. They know what didn't happen because of them. They know which version of reality the public never saw. That creates a peculiar kind of silence. Not defensive, not resentful, heavy. It's the silence of someone who understands that speaking wouldn't just expose another person, it would expose themselves. Because if footage was destroyed at someone's request, questions would follow. Why did you agree? What did you see? What did you erase? And why did you think it mattered? Those are not questions you answer casually. And perhaps that's why Trevor Engelson didn't frame himself as a victim, didn't reclaim the narrative, didn't offer counterpoints, because doing so would require opening a door that had been sealed deliberately. There's also the emotional dimension, which we shouldn't ignore. Long-term relationships don't end cleanly. Even when they end decisively, people carry residual loyalties, habits of protection, a reluctance to cause harm even after harm has been done. It's possible that silence was at least initially an act of restraint rather than fear, but restraint that lasts this long changes shape. It stops being emotional and becomes structural, and that structure hardens over time. What's striking is how well his silence held, even when public narratives about Meghan's past began to simplify. When early years were reduced to sound bites, when complexity gave way to clean arcs, he let those simplifications stand, which again raises the uncomfortable possibility that correcting them would have required acknowledging things better left unacknowledged. Like a wedding that didn't align with the later story, like footage that contradicted the tone of reinvention, like a version of intimacy that no longer fit the official script. Silence protects many things, but it protects secrets most of all, and secrets don't stay inert. They accumulate pressure that doesn't explode all at once, but leaks in glances, in hesitations, in the way people answer questions slightly sideways, which is why this story isn't about waiting for Trevor Engelson to speak out. It's about understanding what his silence already tells us, that something exists, or once existed, that doesn't belong in the current narrative, that someone decided it shouldn't, and that decision was respected long enough to reshape public memory. But here's the thing about silence. It works best when the people who benefit from it remain powerful. When that balance shifts, even slightly, the silence starts to feel less stable. And once people begin asking why someone never spoke, they've already begun to listen. Because the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the most dangerous information. And if Trevor Engelson ever stops being silent, not publicly, not dramatically, but in small, incremental ways, the story won't begin with what he says. It will begin with what he confirms never existed. And that's where things stop being hypothetical. Because in the next chapter, we have to ask a harder question. What kind of past requires this level of protection? And what happens when the future no longer rewards the effort it took to erase it? Before the cameras mattered, before anyone was imagining palaces or protocols or press briefings written in the passive voice, there was a life that didn't need to be explained. That's the part that tends to get skipped. Because when a public figure becomes symbolic, their early years are usually compressed into a few convenient phrases. Before fame, before it all changed, before the world was watching. But those phrases hide more than they reveal. They suggest innocence, or obscurity, or irrelevance. And in this case, none of those quite fit. Long before the royal narrative hardened, before every gesture was parsed for meaning, before restraint became a requirement rather than a choice, there was a version of Meghan Markle that existed comfortably in a different ecosystem, Hollywood. Not the red carpet fantasy version, the working one, the one built on networking dinners, speculative scripts, favors owed, rooms where people talk too loudly and promise too much. The kind of world where ambition isn't hidden, it's expected. In that world, reinvention isn't suspicious. it's survival. People change names, adjust backstories, emphasize certain chapters, and quietly drop others. No one blinks. No one keeps score. Until they do. Meghan didn't arrive in that space as an outsider. She grew up adjacent to it. She understood performance, not just acting, but presentation. How to read a room, how to lean in, how to take up space when needed and retreat when it served her better. None of that is a criticism. It's a skill set, one that Hollywood rewards generously. And in that environment, personality is currency. Big personality, expressive personality, confident, theatrical, sometimes impulsive personality. It's celebrated, encouraged, amplified. The irony, which will matter later, is that those same traits become liabilities in institutions that prize continuity over charisma. But in the early years, there was no reason to imagine such a future. This was a period defined by movement, by experimentation, by saying yes more often than no, by learning where the edges were, by stepping over them. Friends from that era described someone energetic, social, unafraid to perform even when no one asked for a performance, comfortable being the center of gravity in a room. Again, none of this is scandalous, it's human, but it's also specific. And specificity is what makes later revisions difficult. When biographies later emphasize professionalism, discipline, restraint, it creates a contrast that has to be managed carefully. You can't erase one personality and install another without friction, unless the artifacts of the earlier version are gone. That's why the pre-fame years matter here, because if the wedding footage showed not just joy but a particular mode of being, loud, playful, theatrical, unfiltered, then it wouldn't just clash with a royal image. It would clash with the idea that transformation was gradual and organic. It would suggest something else, that certain aspects were not evolved out of, but edited out. Hollywood doesn't judge people for being expressive, but it does remember. And memories don't disappear just because someone stops acknowledging them. Which brings us back to the marriage itself. The relationship with Trevor Engelson unfolded in the same environment. Two people navigating an industry built on proximity and aspiration. Long hours, social overlap, the blurring of personal and professional identities. They were not building a quiet domestic life removed from ambition. They were moving through spaces where visibility mattered, even when no one famous was watching. That context matters because it shapes what a wedding means. In some cultures, weddings are solemn, scripted, predictable. In others, they're performative, loose, emotional, a chance to express a version of self without filters. Destination weddings, especially, tend to lean into that freedom. People let go, they improvise, they behave differently than they would under familiar social constraints. If that's the environment this wedding existed in, and multiple attendees have described it that way, then the footage would capture something rawer than later narratives allow for. Not wrong, just incompatible. And incompatibility is often more threatening than wrongdoing, because wrongdoing can be explained away, apologized for, contextualized. Incompatibility just sits there, unmoving. Now, think about how quickly narratives solidify once someone enters an institution like the monarchy. Suddenly, there's a before that has to be framed as leading inevitably to the after. Every prior experience becomes part of a tidy arc. Nothing can feel out of character, because character itself becomes a public asset. That's where early footage becomes dangerous. Not because it reveals bad behavior, but because it reveals consistency where change is being sold. And if there's one thing institutions fear, it's evidence that undermines the story of becoming. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Was the wedding footage a problem because it showed excess, or because it showed continuity? Because continuity suggests that what came later wasn't a transformation, it was a relocation. Same traits, new stage. And if that's true, then the effort to erase earlier artifacts takes on a different meaning. It's no longer about hiding a wild night, it's about controlling contrast. That control doesn't happen accidentally. It requires awareness, foresight, a sense of trajectory, and that's why some people who knew Meghan in those early years say the seeds of image management were already visible. Not in a sinister way, in a pragmatic one. Curating how you're perceived isn't unusual. Most people do it instinctively. But the scale matters. Deleting old social media posts is one thing. Asking for the destruction of a wedding record is another. One is reversible, the other is permanent. Unless it isn't, because here's the other truth about Hollywood. Nothing ever truly disappears. People keep copies without remembering why. Hard drives get forgotten. Old phones resurface. Someone's assistant backs something up automatically and never deletes it, which means erasure is never total. It's probabilistic. You reduce the odds, you don't eliminate them. And living with that knowledge creates its own tension, especially when your future depends on the absence holding. That tension is what we're circling now. Because if the pre-fame years contained versions of self that were later deemed unacceptable, then the people who witnessed them didn't just fade away, they watched. They compared. They noticed what was emphasized and what wasn't. And over time, silence started to feel less like coincidence and more like curation. That's the shift we're tracking. From organic memory to managed history. From living past to edited past. From this is who I was to this is who I have always been. And the wedding sits at the center of that shift. A single day, captured on camera, full of emotion. Too full, perhaps. If it had survived publicly, it would anchor the earlier narrative in something tangible, something undeniable. Without it, everything becomes interpretive, and interpretation favors those with power. Which is why the question we're inching toward isn't whether Meghan was different before fame. Everyone is. The question is whether that difference had to be destroyed to make the later story work. And if so, who decided that? Because the moment someone decides that a past must be erased rather than integrated, the past doesn't just disappear. It waits. And in the next chapter, we have to confront the moment when that waiting may have turned into action. Because according to people familiar with what happened next, there came a point when silence wasn't enough. A point when a decision had to be made. Not about who someone used to be, but about what evidence of that person could be allowed to survive. There's a moment in stories like this where speculation hardens into something more deliberate. Not proof, not confirmation. Decision. According to people who claim familiarity with the sequence of events, that moment came after the wedding glow faded, after routine set in, after the footage stopped feeling like a keepsake and started feeling like a variable. Not dangerous yet, just unpredictable. And unpredictability is what people who plan ahead tend to eliminate first. If you're looking for a dramatic scene, raised voices, ultimatums, tears, you probably won't find it here. That's not how these decisions are usually made. They happen in quieter settings. On ordinary days, over conversations that feel practical rather than emotional. The kind of conversations where someone says, almost casually, we should probably get rid of that. Not because it's bad, but because it doesn't fit. This is the point where the story becomes less about personality and more about process. Because deleting wedding footage isn't an emotional reaction, it's a logistical operation. And operations leave trails. Let's slow this down and walk through what that would actually require. First, you'd have to identify what exists: professional footage, raw files, edited versions, unedited backups, still photos, behind-the-scenes clips, phones used by guests, cameras used by friends, files sent casually through email or shared folders. Even in 2011, redundancy was the norm. People didn't trust single copies. They stored things across devices without thinking about it, which means that if someone wanted everything gone, they'd have to think the way an archivist thinks. What's out there? Who has it? Who might have forgotten they have it? And how much effort is too much effort? Because the harder you push, the more questions you invite. That's the balance. According to those who say the footage was deliberately destroyed, the request wasn't framed as panic. It was framed as housekeeping, tidying up, closing a chapter, a suggestion, not a demand, But suggestions from one partner to another carry weight when the relationship dynamic tilts in one direction, especially if one partner is thinking about future opportunities and the other isn't yet aware of how high the stakes might become. If you believe the accounts, the emphasis wasn't on shame, it was on strategy. This isn't us anymore. We don't need this. It's better if it's gone. Language matters here. Because framing deletion as mutual, as something that benefits both parties, lowers resistance. It turns erasure into agreement. An agreement is easier to live with later than coercion. The next step would be prioritization. What's most important to remove? Not everything carries the same risk. Grainy phone clips matter less than professionally shot footage. Long, continuous recordings matter more than still photos. Audio matters because it captures tone. Movement matters because it shows energy. If there were moments that felt especially unguarded, improvised vows, jokes that landed in the room but wouldn't land later, behavior that contradicted the image someone wanted to project, those would rise to the top of the list. Not because they were wrong, but because they were specific. Specificity anchors memory. It makes reinterpretation harder. And reinterpretation is essential when you're rewriting a narrative. Then comes the human element. Who do you ask? Who do you trust to comply without questioning? Who do you avoid because they might refuse, or worse, talk about being asked? Every request carries risk. Every follow-up increases it, so the operation would have to be selective, contained, quiet. Which means it likely relied heavily on one person who had access to most of the material and the social proximity to reach others without raising alarms. Someone like Trevor Engelson. Not because he was in charge, but because he was positioned. If he asked, it would sound normal. If he followed up, it wouldn't seem suspicious. If he said, "We're just cleaning things up," most people would nod and move on. And once he complied himself, once he deleted his own copies, the psychological hurdle for others would be lower. People mirror behavior. If the groom doesn't keep the footage, why should they? That's how erasure spreads. Not through force, through example. But here's the part that complicates things. Deleting files isn't always permanent. People think it is, but it often isn't. Files linger, systems cache, backups persist. Drives get copied, old devices resurface, which means that anyone serious about erasure would have to revisit the decision periodically. Check again, confirm again, and that creates a rhythm, a maintenance cycle. Every year that passes without footage surfacing reinforces the belief that the operation worked, but it also reinforces vigilance, because if something appears later, it won't just be a surprise, it will be a failure. And failures in image control aren't treated lightly. This is why people familiar with these kinds of situations say that once deletion begins, it rarely stops at one round. It becomes a mindset, a way of relating to the past. Anything that doesn't serve the future gets quietly removed, which brings us to the contradiction at the heart of this chapter. If the footage was truly harmless, if it showed nothing but joy, nothing but love, nothing but normal celebration, then the cost of deleting it makes little sense. Because erasure carries its own risk. It invites curiosity. It creates gaps. It gives skeptics something to point to. Most people accept their pasts because fighting them draws more attention. So why choose the riskier path? The only explanation that holds is that the footage didn't just show happiness. It showed a version of self that someone didn't want compared against the future version. Comparison is dangerous. It's the one thing image control can't survive, because comparison asks the audience to judge continuity, and continuity collapses curated narratives. This is why people who say the footage included wild party-style vows focus less on the word wild and more on the word party. Party-style vows aren't about content, they're about tone. They suggest looseness, humor, performance for the room, rather than deference to tradition. In Hollywood, that reads as charisma. In royalty, it reads as instability, the same behavior, different judgment, which means the footage wouldn't just undermine a royal image. It would undermine the argument that the royal environment was a natural fit. And if that argument collapses, so does a lot of the moral authority built on top of it. so deletion becomes not just protective, but foundational. You don't delete the footage to hide who you were. You delete it to prevent people from questioning who you claim to be. Now think about the emotional cost of that, because if Trevor Engelson participated in this, again, allegedly, he wouldn't just be deleting files. He'd be deleting shared history, moments that mattered to him too. And people don't give that up lightly, which is why this chapter matters. Because if he did comply, it suggests the request carried weight beyond personal preference. It suggests that refusing wasn't an option he felt comfortable exercising. And that tells us something about the power dynamics in that relationship. Dynamics that don't disappear just because a marriage ends. What we're left with is a picture that's incomplete, but increasingly coherent. A wedding that existed vividly in memory, but not in archives. A deletion that required cooperation rather than chaos. A silence that held long enough to reshape public perception. And a question that gets harder to avoid the longer you sit with it. If this much effort went into erasing one day, what else was considered too risky to keep? Because in the next chapter, we're going to look at what that wedding allegedly showed, not in lurid detail, but in contrast. The kind of contrast that turns celebration into liability. And once we do, the logic of erasure stops feeling abstract. It starts feeling inevitable. There's a temptation, when people hear phrases like wild vows or party-style wedding, to jump straight to judgment. That's the wrong instinct. Because the issue here was never morality. It was mismatch, tone, energy, aesthetic. The kind of mismatch that only becomes a problem when the future you're moving toward demands a very specific version of you. One that leaves little room for improvisation, according to people who say they were present, or who later heard detailed descriptions from those who were. The Jamaican wedding didn't resemble a traditional ceremony. It leaned into celebration, looseness, a sense that this was less about ritual and more about expression. The vows, in particular, are what keep coming up in quiet conversations, not because of what was said exactly. No one is quoting lines, no one is claiming explicit content, but because of how they were delivered. Animated, personal, playful, more performance than proclamation. Think about that for a moment. In Hollywood, that's a strength. It reads as confidence, presence, charisma, the ability to hold a room. In royal culture, it's a red flag. The monarchy doesn't just value tradition. It values predictability, measured tone, emotional restraint, a kind of continuity that reassures by being familiar. And here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. If the wedding footage showed a woman comfortable commanding attention, playing to the crowd, injecting humor or flair into a moment that's usually solemn, that footage wouldn't just clash with royal protocol. It would contradict the idea that adapting to that protocol was ever effortless, because adaptation implies change. And footage like that would suggest continuity. Same instincts, same performative confidence, same comfort with spectacle, just transplanted into a different setting. That's not scandalous, but it's destabilizing. It invites comparison. And comparison undermines the narrative that tension with the royal institution emerged purely from misunderstanding or external hostility. It suggests something more structural, a clash of temperaments. Now add the visual element. Several people who claim knowledge of the footage describe the dress as dramatic, Hollywood-inflected, designed to stand out rather than blend in. Again, not inappropriate, just revealing. Clothing, like vows, communicates values. A dress that leans towards spectacle communicates comfort with being seen, with being memorable, with being the focal point. That's rewarded in one world, it's regulated in another. And if that image existed on camera, if it showed someone fully inhabiting that mode without apology, it would create a problem that no amount of later explanation could fully resolve. Because people trust images more than words. They trust tone more than statements. They trust what they see someone doing when they're not thinking about how it will be judged later. Which brings us back to the word fit. Royal aides talk about fit constantly. Fit for the role. Fit for the institution. Fit for the expectations. What they rarely talk about publicly is how unforgiving the idea of fit can be when it's retroactive. Because once someone is positioned as a symbol, Their past is reevaluated through that lens. Things that once felt charming start to look excessive. Things that once felt expressive start to look uncontrolled. And anything that supports that reevaluation becomes a liability. That's why the alleged content of the wedding footage matters less than the energy it captured. Energy doesn't age well across contexts. You can reframe words, you can reinterpret intent, but you can't easily reframe presence. Presence is visceral. It's the thing people remember even when they forget details. So if the footage showed someone thriving in a setting defined by freedom, informality, and performance, and if that footage later sat uneasily alongside the expectations of royal comportment, the logic of erasure starts to make emotional sense. Not ethical sense, emotional sense. Because people don't delete things they're ashamed of. They delete things they're afraid will be misunderstood later. That distinction matters. Fear of misunderstanding is powerful. It drives preemptive action. It justifies extreme measures under the guise of protection. If people see this, they won't understand. That's the sentence that ends a lot of archives, and it's often spoken long before anyone asks to see what's being hidden. Here's another detail that surfaces repeatedly in accounts. The atmosphere. People describe the wedding not as chaotic, but as unrestrained, less curated, less self-conscious. The kind of environment where someone's natural instincts come through without filtration. No handlers, no advisors, no protocols, just people being themselves. That's precisely what makes footage from that day so potent. Because once someone becomes hyper-aware of optics, those unguarded moments become irreplaceable and unmanageable. They don't align with the later performance. And that's when history becomes something to edit rather than integrate. Now, let's pause again. Nothing described here is inherently negative. Nothing implies wrongdoing. Nothing suggests anything that wouldn't be accepted, even celebrated, in most social contexts. The issue is contrast. Contrast with later expectations. Contrast with later narratives. Contrast with the idea that the royal environment was a natural extension of who someone had always been. If the footage challenged that idea, then it wouldn't matter how innocent it was. It would still be dangerous. Dangerous because it would complicate sympathy. Dangerous because it would introduce questions. Dangerous because it would show that adaptation wasn't just difficult, it was transformational. And transformations invite scrutiny. People ask why. They ask how much was changed. They ask what was lost. Which brings us back to the alleged decision to destroy the footage. If you accept that the wedding showed a version of self that later became incompatible with a required image, then erasure stops being about hiding behavior. It becomes about protecting a story that depends on coherence, a story that can't tolerate visible seams. And once you accept that logic, you start to see how easily it extends beyond one wedding. If one artifact is too risky, others might be too. If one memory needs to disappear, others might need softening. If one version of self is no longer useful, it might need to be replaced entirely. This is how personal history becomes modular, kept, discarded, revised. And it's how people around that history get pulled into roles they never asked for. Keepers of silence, participants in erasure, people who agreed, at the time, because it felt practical, and later realized the cost was permanent. Because when you destroy something that captured joy, you don't just remove evidence, you remove a reference point. And without reference points, narratives become easier to control. But control has a half-life. And in the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens when the demand for control expands beyond one moment, when erasure stops being an exception and starts becoming a pattern. Because once you start prioritizing image over memory, the line between curation and self-betrayal gets thinner than anyone expects. And some people notice when it's crossed. There's a point where this story stops being about a wedding and starts being about systems. Because weddings don't get erased in isolation. They get erased when they collide with something larger, more rigid, more demanding than personal memory. In this case, that collision has a name: institutional optics. Hollywood and the monarchy operate on entirely different logics, even though they both trade in image. One thrives on reinvention, the other survives on continuity. One rewards disruption. The other treats disruption as a threat to legitimacy. And when a person moves from one system to the other, they don't just change environments, they carry residue. Hollywood is forgiving about past versions of you. It expects them. It almost requires them. Your early work can be messy. Your early persona can be inconsistent. That's not a liability. It's proof of evolution. The monarchy is the opposite. It doesn't ask who you were. It asks who you will represent. And representation is not personal. It's symbolic. Once someone enters that structure, their history stops being theirs alone. It becomes part of the institution's risk profile. Every artifact, every anecdote, every image gets evaluated not for truth, but for compatibility. Does this support the story we're telling? If yes, it stays. If no, it becomes a problem. That's the framework that makes the alleged destruction of wedding footage intelligible. Not excusable. Intelligible. Because from the perspective of institutional optics, a pre-royal wedding that reflected Hollywood sensibilities, theatricality, informality, expressive dominance, would not be neutral. It would be discordant. And discordance is treated aggressively by systems that rely on tradition to justify authority. Let's talk about why. Royal legitimacy doesn't come from personal achievement. It comes from continuity, from the illusion that nothing fundamental ever changes, even as everything else does. That illusion is maintained through ritual, restraint, repetition. When someone enters that world with a background that visibly contradicts those values, the contradiction has to be managed. You can't erase a person's past entirely, but you can reduce the amount of it that's visible. That's where optics come in. Optics isn't about truth, it's about perception. And perception doesn't need to be complete, it just needs to be coherent. A wedding video that showed someone thriving in a freewheeling performative environment wouldn't just challenge personal narratives, it would challenge the idea that royal life was ever a natural fit. It would suggest friction at the level of temperament, not misunderstanding. And that's much harder to explain away. This is why institutions prefer ambiguity over evidence. Ambiguity can be managed. Evidence can't. An absence of footage allows for interpretation. It allows supporters to imagine one thing and critics to imagine another. It keeps the conversation theoretical. Footage would anchor it. It would force everyone to confront a specific image rather than an abstract idea. And specificity is dangerous. Which is why, when people talk about Hollywood versus royal optics, they're not talking about morality, they're talking about tone management. In Hollywood, being expressive is a feature. In royalty, it's a liability. In Hollywood, standing out is rewarded. In royalty, blending in is survival. In Hollywood, personal branding is everything. In royalty, personal branding is subordinate to institutional branding. When those worlds collide, something has to give. And often, it's the past. This isn't unique to Meghan Markle, but her case is unusually visible because the transition was so dramatic. One world to another, one value system to its inverse, which makes any artifacts from the first world unusually sensitive. A Hollywood-style wedding video doesn't just show joy, it shows ease in a mode of being that later becomes constrained. That ease would raise questions. Was adaptation genuine or performative? Was tension inevitable or manufactured? Was the struggle with royal protocol about cruelty or incompatibility? Those are questions no institution wants the public to explore too deeply, because they don't end neatly. And if the footage was destroyed, the destruction would serve a very specific function. It would eliminate a visual reference point that made those questions unavoidable. Instead, the story remains abstract. Supporters can argue that royal life was hostile. Critics can argue that adaptation failed. Both sides argue without evidence. And the institution remains protected from having to answer whether the mismatch was structural rather than circumstantial. That's the power of erasure. It doesn't prove anything. It prevents disprove. Which brings us back to the idea of fit. Royal insiders often speak about fit in euphemisms. They talk about learning curves, challenges. What they rarely say out loud is that some people never fit. Not because they're flawed, but because the system has no room for who they are. And when that happens, the institution does what institutions always do. It deflects responsibility, it reframes the story, and it minimizes contradictory evidence. Now imagine being someone at the center of that collision. You've lived comfortably in one system, you understand its rules, you know how to win there. Then you move into another system that operates on the opposite logic. Suddenly, traits that once served you well become sources of friction. Charisma becomes dominance. Expressiveness becomes unpredictability. Agency becomes threat. That's a psychological shock. And people respond to shocks by trying to regain control. One way to do that is to control the narrative. Another is to control the archive, which is why the alleged destruction of wedding footage fits into a broader pattern of image management, rather than standing out as a singular act. If the wedding represented a peak moment of unfiltered Hollywood identity, then removing it from the record would make the transition appear cleaner than it was. Less jarring, less contradictory, more meant to be. And that's the story institutions prefer, not because it's true, but because it's stable. Stability is the real currency here. The monarchy doesn't need people to believe everything they see. It needs people to stop questioning the framework itself, and questions tend to multiply when inconsistencies are visible. That's why, in moments of crisis, institutions often tighten control rather than loosen it. They don't open archives. They seal them. They don't explain contradictions. They reframe them. They don't integrate disruptive histories. They minimize them. If the wedding footage existed, and if it contradicted the tone expected of a royal figure, then its erasure would be consistent with institutional self-preservation. Again, this doesn't require malice. It requires alignment. Alignment between personal ambition and institutional expectation. Alignment between silence and reward. Alignment between erasure and advancement. Which brings us back.